Today's question is, what's the most inappropriate thing you've witnessed at a funeral?
My father's funeral. After the service and the reception after, my mother, brother, and sister headed back to our family home. A bunch of my father's siblings and their family were also staying at the house with us. We got home a few minutes before everyone else. I was sitting at a table in the living room when I could see their cars come down the driveway. They all got out and were hugging and seemingly congratulating each other. The reception after the service was beautifully put together and was actually a fun time. A fitting send-off for my father. So I assumed they were still just having fun from that, until they came inside. They all came in together very quickly and quietly. They came up to me and my older brother sitting at the table and kind of crowded around like a bunch of kids, about to see if they could have a cookie before dinner. My Aunt Barbara smugly stood at the front and asked, "So when are we going to be doing the reading of the will to see what was left to us all?" My brother and I just looked at each other for a few moments before we turned to them to say, "Are you kidding? Reading of the will? Like a soap opera? There is no reading of the will. Everything that belonged to my father now just belongs to my mother." The look of defeat, but not shame, was disgustingly transparent. They were supposed to stay another few nights. They packed up and left that afternoon. My own kids, boys ages 10 and 8. At their great-grandfather's wake, they got a chair and moved it to the casket and started making his mouth into smiley face, laughing the whole time. When me and their grandfather, my father-in-law, saw it, I immediately pulled them away and told them they shouldn't do that. Grandpa laughed and said, "It's fine. He would have really loved that they did that." We later found out that the great-grandfather had asked the funeral home ahead of time to put a sign in his hand that said, "It was a funeral for an uncle I was very distantly related to, and this is happening in Greece. In the summer, the church is very full and incredibly hot. You can smell the sweat. There's incense. The air isn't circulating. And the priest is just going on and on." I don't think I can describe how grim the situation was. Not totally unexpectedly, therefore, just as the priest is getting to something particularly emotional, a man, an old colleague standing near the back, faints. He's completely out. Now, this guy was very tall and rather broad. So not only was it a miracle that he didn't take out the two tiny old ladies right in front of him, he was also really difficult to carry outside to get some air. Somebody has the brilliant idea that the pallbearers, those people who carry the casket, should carry him, since they've practiced it and are reasonably strong. So everybody squeezes a bit tighter. Nobody wants to leave the church. Things just got interesting to let them through. They pick him up, 3 on one side and 3 on the other, i.e. more or less as they would the casket, and start carrying him towards the door. Suddenly, this guy wakes up, turns his head several times, grasps what's going on and who's carrying him faster than anybody can respond, and immediately starts yelling, "I'm alive. I'm alive. I'm alive." At which point, one of the pallbearers laughs so hard that he drops what was thankfully a leg, and the others struggle to put him down in what is now a church absolutely exploding with laughter. The whole situation went on for a good 15 minutes in which this guy walked outside and the priest tried to resume the service, but there absolutely continued to be giggles throughout. I, being a teenager at the time, also couldn't possibly hold it back every time I thought of this guy yelling he's alive. Nobody was even particularly upset because the uncle we were burying was always laughing and joking around, so it somehow felt appropriate that we had a great laugh at his funeral. A relative of my husband died. There was a gathering at her house after the funeral, hosted by her husband. It was mostly family of my husband, but there were a few friends. There was catered food and drink, and people were just general socializing and telling nice stories about the deceased. About 2 hours in, a man and woman in their mid-20s show up. They are acquaintances of the widower. They walk around the house a bit, grab a drink, and then disappear. I was asked to get some more drinks from the garage, which was off the kitchen. I opened the door and stepped into the garage. There was the young couple, leaning against a car and engaging in some pretty vigorous sexual relations. Another family member who was standing in the kitchen saw what I saw. I backed out of the garage because I was fairly embarrassed. I mean, Who does that at a funeral? I guess the other relative told the widower, because the next thing I know there is shouting from the garage and the widower is telling these two people in no uncertain terms that they needed to leave. Apparently, not only were they having sex in the garage, but they were doing lines of coke off the hood of the car. Only a few people who were at the gathering found out what happened. Thank goodness. My cousin's funeral. He was 27 years old and killed in a single car crash after he hit a slippery patch on the road and smashed into a concrete wall. At his funeral, all of his brothers, sisters, and parents sat on the front row at his graveside service. Then, lo and behold, my cousin's ex-girlfriend of over a year shows up and immediately inserts herself onto the front row next to his sisters, and proceeds to scream, cry, scream, wail, and throw herself on the ground periodically throughout the service. All of the family just gave her awkward stares, with no one wanted to address her inappropriate behavior. I had never seen that type of attention-demanding drama queen antics before or since. Edit. Just wanted to throw this in. This was a funeral with military honors, Air Force, and they did the gun salute at the gravesite. I don't remember how many times they fire, but at each gunshot, she would literally shriek and collapse into the arms of either of the sisters standing next to her. I do recall at the very end, the youngest sister was sick of that shit and just let her fall on the ground. And it was raining heavily and rather muddy. The worst is hard to call because I've seen a lot. Some honorable mentions. A rando walking on off the street and proceeding to help herself to coffee and oating in our bathroom. Didn't die. Did get Narcaned. A couple fooling around in the urn/casket showroom during the viewing. An angry old woman storming out of the bathroom with a fistful of tampons, screaming about how inappropriate we were for keeping them in there. Because there are children here. She threw them at the funeral director's face. They were kept in a cabinet in a small basket, well hidden from public view. She was definitely rifling around to have found them. We were no longer allowed to keep our sanitary products in the restrooms after this. A grief-stricken mother tipping her son's casket while wailing and trying to climb inside. Less inappropriate than it was terribly sad. Caught a junkie relative digging deep into the pockets of the deceased looking for the family and is assumed money. A woman pulling down her child's pants and letting it shit in a potted plant. The funeral home owner's horrible dog sashaying up to the front and taking a giant liquid shit in front of the casket and horrified guests in the middle of the service. The same dog biting someone at another service. Tons of brawls. Lots of drinking. Biker funerals were insane. The women were meaner than hell and fighting one another constantly. The dudes were awesome though. Super respectful, cleaned the place up perfectly, and even hauled their trash away. Most of which was bags of beer cans and liquor bottles. I loved biker funerals. I have some, so many, but I'll stop here. My grandmother spent the last decade and a half of her life in a nursing home with severe Alzheimer's and depression after being kicked out of 2 other places previously for trying to kill herself. Her last years were of weary terror, not remembering her children that would visit when they could and would ask only where her mother was, and breaking down in tears when she inevitably realized what was going on, as little as she could. She lived mostly as a result of modern pharmacology and medical science with little to no quality of life. Before she passed, she'd agreed to have a priest from the church she grew up in come in and say a few words. Keep in mind this arrangement was made nearly 15 years before she passed. On the day of her funeral, the big news story was the court battle over Terry Shavo and the right of family to keep her on life support versus her husband's desires to remove her from it. For those that don't remember, the church got involved and made a major thing about how taking her off life support was akin to murder. Feeling the need to opine, the priest, who had never met her and knew nothing about her, took the cue and spent 10 minutes talking about how life support is part of God's plan and removing people from it is murder, and that the concept of euthanasia was legalizing genocide. He talked about how the Nazis' extermination of the Jews was like what was going on in Florida, and how if God saw fit to grant us life, then it's our obligation to accept it as a gift no matter the circumstances. The room was a level of deafening silence as no one could believe what words had just been spoken, what concepts had been advocated, what disconnect from the situation had been demonstrated. A man of the cloth was supposed to be there to comfort us in a time of distress and had, instead, insisted that the decades of pain and suffering of this poor woman were righteous and God's will. And how dare anyone should question whether mercy should have been granted to her. Never have I had to restrain myself more from getting up and physically removing someone from a room. When he was done, I stood up ready to go after him and felt my father's hand on my shoulder. "Let me handle this," was all he said, and walked up to the priest and lead him out. All I remember is hearing the priest say something to the effect of, "Is there a problem?" "There's still more I'm supposed to do," as he was being almost lifted off the floor by his arm and escorted out a door as my mom wept. The only thing I could think of was that she was denied the ability to have any dignity in her death and was now being deprived it even after her passing. A short while later, her casket was lowered into the ground next to her husband, who had passed 30 years before her. It was done without incident and without the priest. And this is the end of today's video. I hope you liked it, and don't forget to comment an anecdote or experience similar to the topic of the video. Leave your like, share if you liked the video, and lastly, don't forget to activate the little bell so you don't miss any of our daily videos. Bye-bye.